welcome. A popular debate among comic book fans is whether or not Marvel's X-Men was based on DC's Doom Patrol. After all, the similarities between the two are rather striking and not easy to immediately dismiss. Conceptually speaking, they are almost identical. Both teams are composed of social misfits that are brought together by a smart man in a wheelchair. Also, both teams were somewhat disliked by the general public. This was more pronounced in the X-Men than in Doom Patrol, to be honest. The tagline for Doom Patrol was, "The World's Strangest Heroes." The tagline for the X-Men was, "The Strangest Superheroes of All." Finally, Doom Patrol regularly fought the supervillains, the Brotherhood of Evil, while the X-Men fought the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. At a glance, there is a solid basis to suggest that the X-Men were a ripoff of Doom Patrol. In fact, the writer and co-creator of Doom Patrol, Arnold Drake, thought the similarities were too numerous to be coincidental. So let's objectively look at the facts and see where that leads. Doom Patrol debuted in My Greatest Adventure number 80. This issue was cover dated June 1963, with an on-sale date of April 18, 1963. The X-Men had a cover date of September 1963, with an on-sale date of July 2, 1963. So, in real time, there were only 10 weeks between the debut of Doom Patrol and the debut issue of the X-Men. As most would accurately point out, the average production time for a comic is roughly 3 months. That's the amount of time it usually takes to write, draw, ink, letter, color, print, and distribute an issue to the newsstands. In other words, 10 weeks falls short of the 12 weeks needed to produce one comic. At the same time, it's not a massive difference. It's tight, but it wouldn't be impossible to complete a comic in 10 weeks. The one factor that is usually overlooked in this discussion is that Jack Kirby, the artist for the X-Men, was a goddamn workhorse. His creative output, especially during the early Marvel years, was staggering. In the same month that the X-Men number 1 debuted, Kirby also fully penciled Fantastic Four number 18, Sergeant Fury number 3, and the Avengers number 1. That's 4 full comics in one damn month. But that's not all. He also drew the covers for Journey into Mystery number 96, Kid Cold Outlaw number 112, Strange Tales number 112, Tales of Suspense number 45, Tales to Astonish number 47, and, finally, Two Gun Kid number 65. That is an incredible amount of work. With the exception of Amazing Spider-Man number 4, it appears as if every title published that month by Marvel Comics had a Jack Kirby cover. As a side note, with the covers, Kirby likely provided the layouts and/or the rough pencils, and the regular interior artist for that title would flesh the image out. That was something Kirby commonly did in the early days of Marvel Comics. It is worth mentioning that the X-Men, the Avengers, and Sergeant Fury were bi-monthly titles. So Kirby probably wasn't always drawing 4 complete comics in 1 month. Regardless, if necessary, he could produce an entire issue in 1 week or less. The point being, despite the aforementioned tight time frame, it wouldn't be impossible for Kirby to draw an entire issue in the necessary amount of time. For his part, Stan Lee, the writer of the X-Men number 1, was also a workhorse. In addition to editing every Marvel comic, he's credited with writing or co-writing the entire Marvel Comics output the month the X-Men debuted. So, in a collaboration between Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, it was quite possible for them to produce a new title in the 10-week time frame. Despite this possibility, getting this comic out would be a scheduling nightmare. At the time, Marvel Comics was distributed by a company owned by DC, and DC placed limits on the amount of titles they would distribute for Marvel in any given month. Obviously, DC did this to ensure Marvel wouldn't eat into their market share by producing more material than they did. In 1963, that limit was between 8 or 10 titles per month. So in order to publish a rushed-out, rip-off version of Doom Patrol, something needed to be bumped from Marvel's schedule, because DC wasn't going to go out of their way to make room for a new Marvel title. And I couldn't find any evidence to suggest that Marvel bumped a title in favor of the X-Men. Many comics, like the Avengers and the X-Men, were bi-monthly titles that alternated with other bi-monthly titles. It appears that the X-Men alternated months with the comic Patsy and Hetty, while the Avengers alternated with Kathy. Logically, Patsy and Hetty and Kathy must have alternated with 2 other titles prior to these new titles. From what I could tell, the 2 titles that were cancelled to make room for the X-Men and the Avengers in the regular bi-monthly rotation were Love Romances and Gunsmoke Western. both of which had their final issues on May 2, 1963, cover dated July 1963. I could find no evidence to suggest these two titles were cancelled for any reason other than a need in the publishing schedule for more superhero titles. Moreover, a debut comic for a continuing series, like the X-Men, generally required about 5 months of production time. This is for character and logo design, as well as refining the overall concept. Again, this is a general timeline. I couldn't find any solid information that defined how long it took for the X-Men to go from concept to final product. This is my long-winded way of saying that the cancellation of those two titles and the development of the titles that would replace them would have been planned out well in advance. Presumably this decision would have been made in February of 1963, which is 3 months before the final issues of Love Romances and Gunsmoke Western hit the stands. However, according to Arnold Drake, Stan Lee may have heard about the Doom Patrol concept months before My Greatest Adventure number 80 was published. This was due to freelancers who worked for either Marvel or DC, or both, chatting amongst themselves about what one company or the other was doing. During this chatter, Stan Lee may have become aware of Doom Patrol. Certainly, this is possible. However, this is speculation that is impossible to confirm. Presuming Stan Lee heard of this idea and decided to copy it, there's no indication that room was made in the publishing schedule to accomplish this. Even if you do presume that the comic was produced and room was made in the publishing schedule, you have to believe that the printer, who work on their own tight schedule and don't exclusively work for one publisher, and the distribution company, which was controlled by DC, would find a place in their schedules to make sure this comic hit the shelves as soon as possible. All of which seems quite unlikely. All of these factors indicate that the similarities between Doom Patrol and the X-Men are simply coincidental. It's an undeniably bizarre coincidence, but the facts don't seem to support any other conclusion. In the end, as with any thorough navel-gazing analysis of this nature, I leave open the possibility that I've overlooked some pertinent detail or details. I also have to admit that I went out of my way to prove that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby could have produced a new comic book series in 10 weeks. While possible, because those two men working together were an unstoppable force of creative energy, I genuinely believe it's highly unlikely they would have gone to such an effort. In my opinion, especially during those early Marvel years, I don't think either of them were paying too much attention to what DC was doing. They were too busy creating an entire universe. That's a rather all-encompassing, time-consuming process. That's it for today. Like, share, subscribe, and comment, and I will talk at you later. Until next time.